The left's tactic is to question everything and not to arrive at a factual answer, but to push you towards the answer where they want you to arrive. If you are, as a grown adult, still at the question everything stage of intellectual development, you do not need to have a platform. You do not deserve to have a platform. By the time you are a grown-ass man, you ought to have settled a few of life's major questions. The question everything mentality is a leftist strategy. When guys like Tucker Carlson and Jason Whitlock and Candace Owens are employing it, they are pushing a leftist strategy. And that is because from Marx to Saul Alinsky, part of the goal is to Welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton. And today, I am going to tell you just a little bit about some of the things that I'm working on. And I just kind of want to think out loud here with you, because the issues that I'm working through are not fully thought out in terms of exactly the way I want to present them to you. Before I get to that, though, I think it'll interest you. I think you'll be very interested in some of the things that I'm working on. But before I get to that, let me address just a couple of quick things that I'm seeing in some of the comments now on YouTube. Please understand that if your comments are more than a couple of sentences, it's very difficult for me to read them because there are just so many comments. I mean, the last episode has, 900, 1,000 comments, and it's just so far, and it was just posted. It's hard for me to keep up with all that. I do my best, and I try to respond, but sometimes it's difficult. But some of the things that I'm seeing there require, perhaps it's just easier for me just to address it all at once. And it brings us back to the topic of the previous episode, which was the whole question everything motif that you're seeing from some influencers who are supposedly on the right, who are supposedly conservative influencers. Again, if you listen to the full podcast, you will know what I'm about to tell you. First of all, that I was not saying don't question anything. I wasn't saying don't question what I'm saying. I was not saying that you should just accept everything that the government, or for that matter, any other authority tells you. I am saying that if you are, as a grown adult, still at the question everything of stage of intellectual development, you do not need to have a platform. You do not deserve to have a platform. By the time you are a grown-ass man, you ought to have settled a few of life's major questions. And a few of them are things like God's existence and what is right and what is wrong, and who the bad guys were and the good guys in World War II. I'm pretty settled on those things. And I'm settled on those things not simply because I sat in a high school or a collegiate classroom, but I'm settled on those things because those who were teaching me at the time usually pointed me to proper source material. That is to say, where I knew where they were coming from. And it's important that you understand that the question everything mentality is a leftist strategy. When guys like Tucker Carlson and Jason Whitlock and Candace Owens are employing it, they may think, I don't know, maybe they really know that they're pushing a leftist strategy. But whether they do or not, they are pushing a leftist strategy. And that is because from Marx to Saul Alinsky, part of the goal is to follow Satan. I mean, there is a reason why Saul Alinsky dedicated Rules to Radicals to his wife. But on the next page, he more or less says he dedicates the book to Lucifer, the first rebel, that is to Satan, to the devil himself. And what did Satan do? He slithers into the garden there in Genesis chapter 3. And he says to the woman, did he, meaning God, did he actually say to you that you shouldn't eat of that tree in the garden? Meaning he's deliberately sets out to undermine what she believes and knows to be true simply by asking questions. That is the goal. I'm not saying to you, do not ask legitimate questions. If there are things that you don't understand, by all means, go and look at reputable sources. But what we saw on Tucker Carlson's show when he had on the chemist is a guy who's read a couple of books, thinks suddenly that he is an authority and is prepared. And he says right there on the show that the narrative that we've had on World War II isn't the right one, meaning a chemist, a guy who isn't trained in this field, comes along after reading a couple of books and has decided that he is qualified to overthrow decades of scholarship from credible, excellent historians. That is some monumental arrogance. That is some monumental arrogance. I wonder what he would think if I read a couple of books on chemistry and decided, you know what, everything you've ever been taught about chemistry is bunk. He would say, you're an arrogant ass, and rightly so, to say something like that. So again, I'm not telling you that you shouldn't ask questions. I'm saying that, as the Apostle Paul himself said and warned, there are those who study and they just keep studying but never arrive at answers. You need to arrive at answers. You need to arrive at the truth. And you should be, as again, the Apostle Paul speaking to the Bereans in Acts chapter 17, I believe it is, that he's telling them, verify what I'm saying. Test it. If you don't think that what I'm telling you is true, be Bereans. They went and they searched the scriptures because he was speaking to them from the Septuagint. They had access to that. They could go and look at that. You can do the same thing here. And that leads me into my next topic. In uncertain times, wise investors look for stability. Markets are overinflated. Inflation remains a concern, and global tensions continue to rise. That's why many are turning to the safety of physical gold and silver. Alpha Omega Gold is a Christian-owned precious metals company known for honesty, transparency, and biblical stewardship principles. Their team helps clients protect their investment with integrity and clear guidance, never pressure. Right now, Alpha Omega Gold is offering a free precious metals navigation guide to explain why owning gold and silver can be a smart, strategic hedge for retirement accounts and long-term security. Don't wait until economic shifts impact your future. Visit alphaomegagold.com or call 855-4AO-GOLD. That's 855-426-4653. Call today to learn how simple it can be to secure what matters most. If there's ever a word that has suffered in recent years, and there have been several that have suffered, it's the word research, because people think that they go and Google something and they call that research. That's not research. That just going and Googling something. And worse are people who are now, and I'm seeing this in the YouTube comments. I'm also seeing this over on X, on Twitter. People are going to Grok, or they're going to, Chat GPT. They're going to artificial intelligence, and they're quoting it as authoritative. So, I say something and they come back and say, well, Grok says, or Chat GPT says, or they say something, it seems pretty clear to me that that's where they got their response. It makes me a bit anxious for where we're headed. First of all, Chat GPT and Grok, or any other form of artificial intelligence, they are not infallible sources of information. They are not. And on several instances, I've seen people quoting them as though they are. But probably what bothers me most that I'm seeing in regards to the use of artificial intelligence, and let me state on the front end, I do not pretend to be an expert in all phases of artificial intelligence. Jonathan, my producer here, has done some pretty remarkable things when I've watched him doing it with artificial intelligence. However, the thing that I'm finding a bit concerning as it relates to AI is that think of like a calculator, just a very simple calculator that you would use for mathematics, okay? When you no longer are crunching the numbers yourself and showing your work, our teachers used to always say to us, I want to see your work. I want to see how you arrived at the answer. And it was a way of making sure that you weren't using a calculator. But when you're no longer doing the actual work and you're plugging in the numbers and just waiting for the calculator to spit them out to you, you start losing an ability. I know I certainly did. You start losing an ability, to do the math yourself and to know how you got from A to Z. AI is a little bit like that, except that in my mind, it's just a little bit worse because, math is factual, right? There's not possible answers. There's, when we're talking about just straight mathematics, there's what's right and there's what's wrong. 2 + 2 = 4. It's not maybe 5. It's not maybe 3. It's 4. We know this. But let us suppose that someone, and there's not a reason to do this, not that I'm aware of anyway, that it relates to, say, your Texas Instruments calculator that you might have used in school, but that they tweak it just a little bit so that on the more complex questions that from your input is giving you slightly and deliberately slightly erroneous answers, but you have no way of really verifying or checking it because you don't know how anymore. You've lost the ability to do long division, or whatever it is. This is where we're going as it relates to the use of AI as a kind of, sort of a more sophisticated version of just using a search engine. That's what it is, really. It's just skipping a step rather than spitting back to you a variety of answers and links that you might click on. It's just summarizing them and spitting it out to you and giving you that. The problem is that these are using very frequently things like Wikipedia. Wikipedia is dangerously false, but you see, it's right in enough things to give you confidence that what it has to say is true, so that you maybe take a figure. And by the way, I haven't checked this. I'm just this particular figure, I'm just using this as an example, and I just about guarantee you that what I'm going to say here is true as it relates to him. But let's just say you went to the Wikipedia page of Donald Trump. Now, it's not going to lie to you about when he was born or when he was president of the United States or things of that nature, but it's going to give you deliberately a very dark narrative as it relates to him, and meaning it will use factual information. And this is the thing that I've tried to warn people about and help you to understand in a show like this, that seeing as I do behind the curtain of how media works, media is very devious, is very clever about creating false narratives using facts. And that's partially what's hard to push back against those kinds of false narratives, because they're using factual narratives, but they're using facts, but they're stringing them together in a way that creates a false narrative. If you follow what I'm saying here, Wikipedia is absolutely the worst. As Musk has noted on several occasions, it's owned by the left. Most of the internet seems to be just simply run by the left. But when we're talking about Wikipedia, we're talking about that in a really big way. And anyone that that the left doesn't like, you can bet that the narrative is going to be very, very negative. It's going to highlight that. Just the same way that Google prioritizes negative returns on conservative figures. It's just what they do. Well, AI is using those kinds of sources. And so I find it troubling when people are coming into the comments and attempting to refute something or maybe even support it, and they're using artificial intelligence. Please do not get lazy like that. I've never used ChatGPT, not a single time. I've not used Grok a single time, other than on on X when Musk has said, you can create these drawings. I've fed into it, hey, give me an image of a warrior on horseback, or something like that. But I don't use it to search out right or wrong, or to help me sort fact from fiction. Now, maybe there will come a day that I have some level of confidence in some kind of limited usage of it, but I'm pretty old school as it relates to that. And as it relates to a show like this, I'm sticking to my lane and to those things where I feel that I have some measure of expertise, and where I feel that I have some measure of competence, and where I've been trained to seek out the answers, to know what is right and what is wrong, and what sources are reliable and which ones are more Wikipedia-like. So if you use something like Wikipedia, just know this: Wikipedia might be very useful to determine, hey, when was Adolf Hitler born? When was Genghis Khan? When did he die? Where was Mr. Bean from? Whatever. There are facts like that it's quite useful about. But the narratives are almost always slanted in a way to give the kind of answer that the left wants. Now, coming back to the whole question everything narrative. Anybody who is a member of the posse and who follows this show knows that what we're doing here is we are thinking, and we're thinking deeply on a range of subjects. If you look at my whole channel, you'll see loads of debates with guys like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett and Michael Shermer. We've never shown ourselves afraid to engage on issues. We've never been afraid to do that, and to do it in a fair and open format. So we're not trying to warp your mind here. Rather, I'm trying to warn you that there are people who are trying to warp your mind. And those are the kinds of people who will tell you, gosh, you should question everything. Yet the way we ended up with men and women's bathrooms was questioning everything, treating facts, biological facts, like they're philosophical questions. What is a man? What is a woman? That's how you arrive at that. It's how we ended up, toppling statues. Is Thomas Jefferson really a hero? Is Douglas MacArthur really a hero? Is George Washington? The left's tactic is to question everything, and not to arrive at a factual answer, but to push you towards the answer where they want you to arrive. And they want you to arrive at a place where you're A, demoralized, and B, you're unsettled because you feel like the things that you've believed in are no longer trustworthy. This is what the so-called new atheists did when they came along with their spate of books, in the years right after 9/11, where they just said, hey, we're just asking questions about whether or not God actually exists. But they didn't do it honestly. They didn't do it with integrity. So you need to be careful with those kinds of things, and to give some consideration to the sources that you're seeking out. If you want to have a better understanding of World War II, Daryl Cooper is not who you want to go and listen to. Definitely not Tucker Carlson or some of the guys that he's platformed. Victor Davis Hanson is a good place to go. He's an actual scholar in that field, and he's reliable. So that's a warning for you. Now, that brings me to this. And here's where I'm inviting you to kind of think with me. And, generally speaking, I like to do a podcast. The members of my team will tell you this. I don't like to do a show until I feel that I have all of my ducks in a row. But sometimes there's a topic that you feel very confident that you understand, such as the one I'm about to present to you. I feel very confident in that regard. But I'm spending a lot of time on the tractor, on my bicycle, walking around the office, bouncing a tennis ball off the wall, in my car, thinking about how to present it in a way that makes the most sense, because I'm trying not to present it in a really, abstruse academic way. And that relates to the issue of fascism and Marxism. Now, some of you will say, gosh, that's an issue that you've hit recently. It is an issue that I've hit recently. It's an issue that I've hit multiple times on ideas have consequences. And I have, because it's so very relevant to the world in which we live. And those members of the posse who follow my work know that I was, I have been to the World Economic Forum the past 3 years, and I plan to go again this next year. Now, we'll have to wait and see if I'm able to get into anything. Last year was the first year that I was stopped, trying to enter anything. So we'll see what happens. And by the way, this is another thing. There are people say, oh, he must be a paid agent. If he's able to get into the World Economic Forum, they don't let anybody in there. Those people who are making those comments aren't people who've even been to the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum is absolutely in love, orgasmic over technology, and especially over the subject we were just discussing, artificial intelligence. They love it, and they love it because they want to create a surveillance state. But the World Economic Forum's annual meeting, and I hope they're not listening right now, is amazingly analog. Analog. You would think that everybody, would have to have a brain chip, or something in order to get in to their meetings. As it is, it's the very old school anywhere conference that you've attended, where people are given a lanyard, with their name and World Economic Forum and their status, maybe a color coding or something that indicates what they're allowed to go into and what they're not allowed to go into. And some of the sessions I would never make it into, like the plenary sessions, the big sessions. Those are really difficult to get into. But there are a lot of little breakout sessions all over the city, and the town is quite small. And almost everybody who is there for the World Economic Forum. And when you couple that with the fact, when you couple the analog nature of the World Economic Forum with the fact that it's in winter, it's January in Switzerland, people are wearing big, big jackets, and almost nobody's lanyard is visible because it's under their clothing. Heavy sweaters and scarves and, a big parka, this kind of thing. And for someone just to walk in very confidently, you usually get away with it. I do. In any case, I have gotten away with it for the last 3 years. We'll see whether or not I am able to do it this next year. But even if I don't get in, it doesn't matter, because some of the most interesting conversations, and particularly this last year, it wasn't when I was in a meeting that I was really gleaning the great stuff. Most of the World Economic Forum is online. I think I want to say 70% of the sessions are online, so I could just sit right here and watch most of it. The really interesting conversations are taking place in hotel lobbies, coffee shops, and restaurants. And because the town of Davos is so small, during the World Economic Forum, the town is hugely overcrowded. The town really is insufficient. It doesn't have the infrastructure for a conference like this. So the result is that if you walk into a restaurant and claim a booth, or a coffee shop and you claim a table, inevitably someone will ask if they can sit with you. And almost always they're attendees at the World Economic Forum. And what follows are fascinating conversations, and often, not always, but often, revelations because they don't know who I am, and they just assume I'm just another weffer, and they tend to speak, quite openly. But again, for the conspiracy theorists out there who think that somehow I'm on the WEF payroll, I mean, you're an idiot. If you think that, you've not watched Ideas Have Consequences. I assure you, they would they would not do not want me to attend that. But I mention it because the World Economic Forum is fascist. It is fascist. And fascism and communism, I went into my granddaughter's, playroom, and I found these building blocks. And what do you know? I mean, they have all kinds of letters and numbers on them, but I found an F and an M. And generally speaking, we think of fascism as being on the, I think it would be for you like this, on the right. Fascism, as the way it's usually taught, is on the right, and Marxism is on the extreme left. Now, what I've been saying to you for quite some time is that this is erroneous. They are both on the left. They're both on the left. And the reason for that is the further you go to the left, the more government control you have, and you eventually arrive at totalitarianism, some form of totalitarianism. And both Marxism and fascism are totalitarian in nature. Now, they arrive there by a slightly different means, but they're both socialist. They both believe in heavy government controls. They're both atheistic to the core, and they both have their roots, or at least partially their roots, in Darwinian evolution. I mean, there's a reason why Karl Marx, who I think I have, the Karl Marx reader right here. There's a reason why Karl Marx wrote to Charles Darwin and wanted to dedicate the first volume of Capital, Das Kapital, to Darwin, who wisely declined the dubious honor. But the reason is because Marx saw in Darwin's biological determinism that biological history is moving irresistibly in a particular direction. It's going from simple organisms to more complex ones. Karl Marx saw in that something that he could apply to his own economic theories, that history was moving in that is to say, specifically economic history was moving irresistibly in a particular direction too, just like biological history. That's the way he saw it, but that it was determined by class warfare. The fascists say, yes, it's moving in a particular direction. We believe that too, but it's different than that. It's a race war. It's a war of the blood versus an economic war. Anyway, I make mention of that because both of these, fascism and Marxism, they both sit on the right. Excuse me. It's my right, it's your left. They both sit on the left because they're both totalitarian, and they're both anti-individual liberty, massive government controls, anti-God, not just simply atheistic, but anti-God, making war on Christians, the authentic ones that can't be made, informers. Both Hitler and Stalin, both the fascists, the Nazis, and the communists left churches open, provided they were churches that were cooperative with the state, that you went to confession and your priest went and told on you to the KGB or to the Gestapo. Those kinds of churches were allowed to remain open, but the real ones, they were shut down. Hence the reason, the guys like Martin Niemöller, were sent to Auschwitz, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, was executed because they didn't cooperate and because they didn't acknowledge the state as supreme. And this is why Francis Schaeffer, I love Francis Schaeffer. If you haven't read Francis Schaeffer, he's worth reading. I don't think Francis Schaeffer is a great writer, but I think he's a great thinker. And Francis Schaeffer, who died in 1984 of cancer, he said this, that Christianity is by its nature rebellious. And it is because, and I kind of sort of quoting here, I'm going from memory, because no totalitarian or authoritarian regime can tolerate a people who say that they have an absolute universal standard by which all men and their governments are judged. Let me repeat that. No totalitarian or authoritarian regime can tolerate a people who say that they have an absolute universal standard by which all men and their governments are judged. This is why the Romans, also on the left, this is why the Roman Empire eventually made war on Christians as well. And it's because they did not acknowledge the state as supreme. The incredible correspondence between Pliny the Younger and Trajan, the emperor. I think Trajan was emperor from, and again, I'm going from memory here, 98 to 117, I believe. But Pliny wrote to him and he said, look, there's this new religion, and it's spreading like wildfire through the provinces. And we're told that these people, they have meetings that our investigations say seem to be of an ordinary, innocent kind, except we're told that these people, these Christians, a true one, cannot acknowledge you, our emperor, as supreme, because they believe in a God who is above you, that is above the state. So whenever we arrest one of these people, we sit them down and we put your image right in front of them and we tell them to worship it. And if they do, if they pay homage to it, then we say they can go. If we do not, said Pliny the Younger, he said, we ask them a second time to do it. And if they refuse, then we execute them. Trajan writes back and says, essentially, it seems to me that the course you're following is an appropriate one. But again, the state demanded that Christians bend the knee and acknowledge the state as supreme. And you see, that's where we are, or certainly where the Biden administration, the Obama administration wanted to take us. There's a reason why they have sought to make war on Christianity in this country. It's why they've sought to import other religions. It's why they have sought to keep it out of schools, out of universities. It's why they are so ready. I mean, I've had these conversations because I speak on college campuses from time to time, and the resistance you get when you want to talk about the historic person of Jesus Christ. And by the way, no credible historian denies that he existed. The real debate has never been about whether Jesus lived or not. The real debate has been over whether or not his claims that he was God are true. That's been the debate. It's not been over. Some of you will come into the comments and say, oh, it's maybe not real. No credible historian believes that Jesus didn't exist. It's whether or not he was, in the words of Chesterton and C.S. Lewis and much later Josh McDowell, was he a liar, lunatic, or Lord? To say that Jesus was just a good teacher, you can't have that, because the guy went around inferring that he was the Son of God. And that means either he was a liar, thus not a good teacher, a lunatic, thus not a good teacher, or he was who he said that he was. So the state, in both fascism and Marxism, and if you like, where we're going these days, which is kind of an interesting mix of the two, demands that you acknowledge the state as supreme. And you see, that's what the whole question everything motif is really about, is to undermine your confidence in sources of truth, in the belief that there is any kind of absolute truth, that there's any kind of anchor or anything that you can hang on to, because the desire is to annihilate all of it and replace it with the state, so that the state becomes, what was it? I've forgotten her name, Ardern in New Zealand, I believe. Isn't her name Jacinda Ardern? The woman there, the prime minister, just throughout the whole COVID crisis, where she was saying in so many words, and she said this directly on one occasion, that we are the source of truth. We're the source of truth. I mean, she said the quiet part out loud. That's what the Biden administration, that's what's happening in Britain with Starmer. That's what's happening in Western Europe. They do not like you acknowledging some other, particularly a divine source of power. Now, I want to be clear at this point. I am an atheist concerning all gods save one. I believe in the biblical God. And I've tested that like a Berean. I've tested that both at a personal level in my own life. I've put my faith and trust in Jesus Christ. Imperfect that I am, sinful that I am, I know my only hope is the blood of Jesus Christ. And I've tested it factually, historically. The truth claims of Scripture, I believe them. Now, you don't have to. I just want you to know where I'm coming from. All other gods are, to me, like DC comic book heroes. They're quite obviously false gods. They're like, that scene in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where there's all these false grails, but there's a real one in there. And don't be distracted by all the false gods, because there is a real one. And you should be an atheist concerning every god save one. And they're not all the same, Tucker Carlson. Muslims do not worship the same God as Christians. They say contradictory things. I mean, according to Muslims, Jesus didn't even die on the cross. That's a little problematic if you're going to say that they worship the same God, because they don't. But as I take you in this direction, I want you to understand that these two, again, as we're thinking, this motif of right and left, the political right and the political left, these two right here, they are like bastard twins. There's some differences. But from the perspective of the government, from the perspective of the governed, there's almost no difference. And all you have to do is ask the people who have lived under both, and those would be people in Eastern Europe. Because in Eastern Europe, they were first, in 1941, Hitler invaded Russia, and of course, numerous other countries in Eastern Europe with Operation Barbarossa. So those people lived under fascism, Nazism for a time. And then after Stalingrad, February of 43, the Russians began moving westward, and they drove the Nazis out. And then they governed in some of those same places, countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania and parts of Germany and so forth. Now, I've just come back from Germany, and it's part of some research that I'm doing for a book. And I've been planning this for quite some time, and I've been thinking about, returning to Germany. It's been a while since I've been there. It's been almost 20 years, not quite 20 years. Excuse me. It's not been quite 20 years since I've been in Germany. I'm in Germany all the time. But it's been almost 20 years since I've been in Berlin. And I think this trip made my fourth or fifth time in Berlin. But my previous trips were in the 90s and in the early 2000s. And the last time I was there, or one of the last times I was there, I had been awarded, it was, after graduate school, I've been teaching for a period of time. And I applied for and won a fellowship. And that fellowship was granted to me as kind of a Fulbright for those who are doing post-grad work, who are teaching. And it was so that I could do some research on the intellectual origins of the Holocaust. So I was in Berlin at that particular time. And it took me to a variety of places related to the Holocaust. Not all of them in Germany, but some of them. I was also in Austria and Poland and elsewhere doing some of that research. But on this particular occasion, I was there and I wanted to get reacquainted with Berlin. And here's just a little travel tip for you. One of the easiest ways, one of the best ways, I think, and I say this as somebody who's travels a lot, and I've led loads of tour groups overseas. I don't know how many, but a lot of them. And as a tour guide, and as someone who consults with other tour guides and who occasionally takes tours himself, one of the best ways to get acquainted with a city is to find a taxi driver that you like. So you might say, for instance, let's just say you're arriving in Paris and you take a taxi from the airport to the hotel, and maybe you chat with the driver. Perhaps you like him, maybe you don't. If you don't, then maybe the next time you take a taxi, you chat with that driver and you decide maybe you do like him. And then you ask him, how much for a 3-hour tour of the city, or a half day, or a full day? What would you charge me for that? And if you can negotiate a good price for that, and it's usually way less than what a tour guide would charge you, do it. Maybe you even do it in addition to an actual professional tour guide, because no one knows a city better than taxi drivers, particularly if you're talking about cities like London. The black cab taxi drivers there. I said that once, and somebody thought I was talking about black taxi drivers, like they were all Africans, or something like that. No. I'm referring to the classic, the vintage, the very famous black, they're called black cab taxis. Find an old guy in a city like London. The tests to become a taxi driver in London are absurdly difficult. I mean, it's like getting a graduate degree. And those guys don't need GPS. They know a city like nobody does. And I love asking them, who's the most famous person you've ever had in your taxi? And if it's an older guy, he will have had a load of famous people, and will tell you some great stories. I've heard some wonderful ones related to people like Tony Blair and Judi Dench and Charlton Heston and Mick Jagger and Charlie Waters. And Charlie Waters? No, Charlie Waters was a defensive back for the Dallas Cowboys. Charlie Watts, the drummer for the Rolling Stones, Laurence Olivier. I've heard loads of good stories like that. But you ask one of these guys, hey, what do you charge me? And they'll usually give you a pretty good rate. And the reason is because it means they don't have to crawl the city looking for fares. A guy who wants to go 3 blocks, and then another one who wants to go, a couple of miles. It's just much easier for them if they negotiate a price with you. And they usually like talking about their cities because they're proud of them and they know them. And the wonderful thing about the taxi drivers is that their opinions are usually unvarnished. They have not been coached. They have not been taught to be PC. They're going to tell you what they think, and you may like the opinions or you may not. But I arrived in Berlin, and following my usual practice, I found a driver that I liked, a guy who was in his 80s. He was retired. He was a very successful businessman, but he got bored and he lives alone. His children are grown. His wife is dead. And he decided, he said, I got tired of sitting around the house waiting to die. He said, so I decided I'd start driving. And so I asked him how much he would charge me to take me around the city of Berlin. And I was interested in knowing his opinion about what it was like growing up, first in the post-World War II period, and then under, and then when the city was divided with the Berlin Wall that went up in August of 1961, and then the collapse of the wall on November 9, 1989, and then reunification and where we are today. And he was more than happy to give me all of that. And I had a few things, I had a checklist of things that I needed to find and I needed to do, but we chatted all along the way. And what fascinated me is this. First of all, the weather was gorgeous. And I will tell you that Berlin, West Berlin, I mean, it's not a city divided by the wall anymore, but you can still tell, both from the architecture and even to some extent by the behavior, that there is a real difference between the vibe of what was once West Berlin and what was once East Berlin. The architecture, a lot of it in East Berlin, it's communist era. The fashionable term these days is brutalist, or what I call intimidation architecture, versus some of what you find in say a place like the Kurfürstendamm, a very beautiful, fashionable boulevard, and Charlottenburg, which is really gorgeous. If you didn't know better, if you knew Paris, and I could transport you into Berlin at a little sidewalk cafe in Charlottenburg or along the Kurfürstendamm, and you opened your eyes, you might think you're in Paris. I mean, it feels very Parisian, all along that area. Berlin is a lovely city, and I would encourage you to visit it. However, there's a caveat. There's a little asterisk, it goes next to that particular comment, and it is this. And it's best illustrated by my conversation. Again, I'm stick with me here, people. I'm thinking out loud. I'm processing this with you, because I'm trying to think of the best way to articulate this, both in a show, but also in an article, maybe even in a book. It's best articulated, at least at this point, by my conversation with my driver, whose name was Rolf. Rolf was born in 1943. Give you just a little background on him. Rolf was born in 1943. He was born in Berlin. Both his parents were from Berlin. That's kind of unusual these days, because the city, they have the same approach to immigration that we've seen all over Western Europe, including Britain, and that the Biden administration, Obama administrations were trying to import into the United States. And that is to say that, ethnic Germans make up less than, or right about 50% of the population of Berlin. So it's changed massively in recent decades, demographically speaking. But here's a guy who's from Berlin. His parents are from Berlin. When he was born in 1943, his father was fighting on the Eastern Front in Russia. And let me tell you, most of those guys didn't come back, but his father did. His father did eventually. He said physically he was a broken man. He was then sent to fight against the Americans. And he said, to his father's good fortune, he was captured by the Americans, held in an internment camp for 3 years. But he said that his father had very little complaints, because the Russians, first of all, he'd never been seen or heard from again, but the Americans fed him and treated him well, according to the dictates of the Geneva Convention. His father ended up dying fairly young in the 1950s, I think, just because he came back from Russia, just a physical wreck due to the cold winters, due to the starvation, just due to the conditions of war there. And he said his earliest memory, Rolf, was 1948. It was the Berlin airlift. Now, if you're not familiar with the Berlin airlift, again, I may dedicate a whole show to that, but the country of Germany, if you can picture this, Germany itself, post-war, was divided into 4 zones. So you had the Russian zone, you had the British zone, you had the French zone, and you had the American zone. And then Berlin itself, which was deep into the Russian zone, deep into East, what would become known as the GDR, what would become known as East Germany. Berlin was deep into the Russian zone, And it too was divided into 4 zones: British, American, French, and Russian. Well, in 1961, the Russians decided to, put a wall around West Berlin, so as to keep people from the east, from the GDR, escaping to the west. Because prior to that, between 1945 and 1961, roughly 3.5 million East Germans fled to the west. So they were losing manpower massively. So they tried to stop it. But before they did that, in 1948, they tried to drive the Allies out of Berlin by strangling the city. They didn't declare war on it, not directly. They just cut off what was known as the Berlin Corridor, the route of trains and trucks and so forth that fed the city from the west, from West Germany. Okay, so they blockaded the city. And that began, thanks to General Lucius Clay, that began who became a hero to the Germans, by the way, that began a massive airlift. A plane was taking off and landing in West Berlin every 2 minutes. Every 2 minutes to feed the city lest they starve. And this went on for almost a year until the Russians finally decided the Americans have the logistical ability to feed an entire city from the air. From the air. So there's no point in trying to blockade the city any longer because it's not working. So they relented. But Rolf was one of those little boys. If you're familiar with the famous picture, and we'll try to put it up here, he's one of the little boys in this picture of children waving to the pilots, who are flying overhead and who are dropping chocolate bars and sugar packets and things of this nature. That was Rolf. So Rolf remembers that well, and he knows all the stories of fascism. He's very familiar with that, and he's very familiar with the communist. He lived in West Berlin, but he knows what the GDR was like because he was able, with a passport, to travel there on a number of occasions. He had family over on that side. You see, when the wall went up in November of 61, it went up so quickly. In August of 61. It fell in November of 89. When it went up so quickly in August of 61 that if your child was at school in what was the Russian zone, and you were at work in what was, say, the British, American, or French zone, boom, you didn't see your child again. That was it. That was it, at least not until the wall fell or unless you were able to work out a means of escape. So he knew what that was like. And so part of what I'm communicating here is that Rolf's political opinions and his historical judgments were sound as he's driving me around the city and is explaining, this building, isn't, from this building is completely modern because the original was destroyed during Allied bombing in World War II. And this building over here was, where the KGB or the Stasi was housed. This over here is the Stasi prison. And this was this. And his historical opinions were logical and sound until Donald Trump came up. And this gets at the heart of what I want to communicate to you, because I think he thought, and I get this a lot overseas, I think he thought he was earning points with me by bringing up Trump. I'd never mentioned Trump. He brought up Trump, and he brought him up derisively and with a snort and sort of a dismissive wave. And I didn't take the bait. I didn't pursue it because I was enjoying my conversation with him. I didn't want it to, to devolve into a political argument. And I was thinking, probably nothing I say is he going to agree with me on this. And I'm really focused on the Cold War history of Berlin and the World War II history of Berlin. But then he mentioned Trump again. And this time he implied that Trump was a fascist. Again, I ignored him. And I'm thinking to myself, it's kind of an interesting charge to make, because here's a guy who was born in fascist Germany and certainly has heard enough about it growing up in that city to actually know what fascism is. And then he grew up during the height of the Cold War. I mean, his life straddled the whole history, of the Cold War, at least the Cold War as we knew it at that time, which would be from 1945 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. He lived through all of that. He was on that wall when it went down in November of 1989. He was there when it went up. He was a teenage boy when it went up in August of 61. It's part of what made him fascinating, because he had lived through arguably Berlin's most famous period of history. But then a third time he mentions Trump. And again, I think he thinks he's earning points with me because he probably is used to being a cab driver for people from New York or Chicago or LA, who almost certainly are not pro-Trump. But he brings him up this third time and again implies he's a fascist. And I decided, okay, I need to address this, but I want to address it gently. You may think I just eat people for breakfast, but I don't. I, like anybody else, I won't say like anybody else because it's not true of everybody, but I want to get along, and I liked him. And as my elder, I certainly wanted to treat him respectfully. And I wanted to have a thoughtful conversation with him about this. And so I just decided to say, look, you grew up, you were born into fascist Germany. You certainly have heard enough about it to know what it is. And the things you've been saying to me so far and pointing out to me have been fabulous. It's been great. I've loved it. And your historical knowledge and opinions, they've just been dead on. Dead on. In fact, I would even say that you're a conservative, politically speaking, looking back. But looking forward, you appear to be a progressive. You appear to be divided on this. So, having said all that, tell me one way, name for me one example, a real example of Donald Trump being a fascist. And this really brings me to a central point of today's Ideas Have Consequences, and that is this. Post-World War II, brilliantly, the communists, the socialists, the Marxists, they marketed communism, Marxism, and socialism as the ideological opposite of fascism. That's the way they marketed it. And in a Europe where people are post-war eager to say they're not fascists because they don't want to be executed by partisans or by governments that are seeking revenge, tribunals, this kind of thing, or be imprisoned, or at the very least be ostracized, maybe dragged out into the street. They don't want any association. Even those who actually had it don't want to say they are Nazis. No, they want to say they're the opposite. What do they all do? They claim that they are communists. They claim they were communists. So the Russians, the Soviets, they brilliantly marketed their ideology as the enemy of fascism. And you see, that carried over into the United States. That has been taught now for 8 decades. Most of you watching this show were taught it. I certainly was. And not by people who are trying to warp my mind. I had excellent history teachers, both in high school and moving straight on up through me being an undergraduate and through graduate school. Much of the time, not always, but much of the time, this is what was being taught. At the graduate school level, by the way, now in that instance, there was some devious stuff going on there. But in this particular case, like somebody's trying to call me. If you guys are the posse, if you ever want to call me, please don't call me during a show. It just isn't the thing to do. Anyway, so this particular narrative has carried the day, so that today still people believe this and they teach it, that they're ideological opposites, but they aren't. As I say, they're bastard children of the same socialist father. There's very little distinction between them. Both of them totalitarian, both of them anti-God, both of them utterly opposed to individual liberty, all about the collective. And one of them allows some measure of private property, but where it's controlled by the state, and the other one where there is no private property and it's controlled by the state. You kind of arrive at the same place. Again, some modest differences, but from the perspective of the governed, there's no difference. Because they both love, worship the state and see the state as supreme and as the absolute truth. So here I am talking to Rolf, and Rolf is making his assertion that Donald Trump is some kind of fascist. He's a would-be Hitler. And I'm asking him, please explain. I'm all ears. Is he rounding up the Jews? Don't think so. Did he force you to take a vaccine and did he do that? Did you lose your job because of that? Was he colluding with Russia? We now know, of course, he wasn't. Smart people knew he wasn't all the time. Is he all about the collective, or does he value individual liberty? Is he making war on God? We discussed last week, I don't think Donald Trump is a Christian, but he has been a champion for Christian. There's no question about that. Is he the one who's mutilating children in Joseph Mengele-like experiments? Is he the one doing that? Is he the one calling little boys girls and little girls boys? Is that him? And of course, Rolf knows that what I'm saying is true, but I can see that he doesn't like it. And he's in kind of a difficult situation because I'm not his employer, but I'm a customer. And so he doesn't really want to tick me off, but I'm like, look, I want to hear your opinion. Tell me what you think. I mean, please explain to me how this is true. So because it isn't true. And I said, Rolf, everything you have complained about on this tour, that you have said that the Nazis did and that the communists did after them, many of them are things that we are now seeing being done by the kind of people who meet at the organization I mentioned earlier in the show, the World Economic Forum. These people are all about the collective. They don't like individual liberty. They think democracy is, they feel nothing but scorn for democracy, just as communists and fascists do. They're not in favor of it. Constitutions, they don't care for them at all because they're elitist. They believe they're the ones who should rule and you should be the ruled. That is how they think. That's exactly the way they think. The point is that Marxism and fascism, post-World War II, due to clever marketing, brilliant marketing, unlike Cracker Barrels, due to brilliant marketing, the Soviets were able to convince not just people in the GDR, not just people in East Germany or East Berlin or on the other side of that wall. They have been successful in carrying off that psyop on the whole West and convincing the West that these two are ideological opposites, and they are not. People wanting to demonstrate that they weren't fascists, all claimed to be communists. And to this day, people believe the two are ideological opposites because they fought a war where millions died. That is simply because they were different groups, both vying for supremacy and power, absolute power. That's also due to ethnic and national differences. It's also due to the fact that the utopians they promise to deliver, it's all just complete nonsense because it's about power. It's about the preservation of power, the acquisition of power. Post-World War II, and this is the thing that really struck me as I was walking around in the evenings, around Berlin. Post-World War II, the communists were able to sock puppet. The old sock puppets you had when you were a kid? The Soviets were able to sock puppet fascism and use it towards their own Marxist ends. Because they readily recognized there really wasn't a big difference between, say, the Stasi and the Gestapo. There really wasn't a big difference between the KGB and the Gestapo or the SS. There really wasn't, at the end of the day, a really big difference. Okay, maybe on a personal level, but not in terms of their ultimate objectives and goals. Not a big difference between Hitler and Stalin. You see, these two ideologies, they're essentially the same. There's some nuanced difference, but in terms of the end result, in terms of what it's like to be governed or to live under either, they're remarkably the same. So as I'm going around the city and I'm touring with Rolf and he's showing me this, that, and the other, it really struck me. And this is the thing you can help me think through the best way to communicate this, particularly to young people who don't understand this at all, because they haven't lived through any of what I'm talking about. The Berlin Wall, I think the Berlin Wall coming down is maybe the most significant event of my lifetime, more than landing on the moon. I was 2 when we landed on the moon. More probably than 9/11. I think the Berlin Wall coming down was massively significant. But here's what's fascinating. They've almost obliterated any real memory of how it was brought down, because it was chiefly brought down by individuals like Pope John Paul II, Lech Walesa, who I heard today on the radio is apparently giving a lecture series. Send me tickets. I will go. I'd love to hear him. Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, those are the real victors of the Cold War, the real engineers who brought down the Berlin Wall. There's almost zero mention of them. When you go to the Brandenburg Gate and nearby, there's a little amphitheater that plays. I don't know if it plays nightly, but it seemed to be playing nightly when I was there. It's telling you the history of Berlin. It's telling you the history of the wall. And I would say 3/4 of the film, and I don't know how long it is, let's say maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes. I watched it twice. 3/4 of the film is quite accurate and interesting. And the very last part is sheer propaganda, is sheer globalist propaganda. And that's what really struck me, as I thought, isn't it interesting that this city has gone from fascism to communism to reunification and freedom, to now it's moving right back in the same direction from where it's come. It's like done a 180 and is going back in the other direction. That's problematic. And that's because the globalist ideology are these two ideologies simply repackaged and presented in a very different form. They know better than to present it the way it's been done before, because it'd be too obvious and too recognizable. but they use all the same buzzwords. They have co-opted the West's use of words like democracy and freedom and tolerance, diversity. All of these words have been stripped of their actual content, of their actual meaning, and replaced with one that can be used by them. And, and I came across a fascinating, it's in one of these books that I've been reading. I'm not sure which one of them, but it was a quotation. His name's gone straight out of my head. Anyway, it was a quotation that said this, an East German, a prominent East German who's Walter Ulbricht. He said this. He said it must, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but he was talking about the GDR and their government. He said it must look like democracy, but where we have all the control. I thought, wow, that is exactly where we are. That's what the left wants. They want it to look like democracy. That's what the globalists want, to look like democracy, but where they have all the power. They want to use the word democracy. They want to say tolerance. They want to say diversity. They want to say freedom, but where there's none of it, because they want to build a surveillance state that would make the Stasi envious. That's why they love the AI. That's why they love the facial recognition that you're being subjected to at the airport. That's why they love the idea of brain chips and all those kinds of things. A chip in your car that can track everywhere you go, not to mention anything about your phone. And that's why they love the artificial intelligence, to return to where we started, the artificial intelligence of things like Grok and ChatGPT and all of that, because they can subtly shape your opinions by altering certain facts and certain details. Sound like a conspiracy theory? It's already happening, ladies and gentlemen, in a very big way. Anyway, these are some of the things that I'm thinking about, that I'm going to be presenting in future episodes of Ideas Have Consequences. I'm interested in your comments. Please share the Ideas Have Consequences, this podcast, with other people. Be sure to hit the like button and join the posse. Join the posse. We'd love to have you as a part of it. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences, and boy, do they have consequences, with me, Larry Alex Taunton.